In the Lost Lands is the latest project adapted from the work of George R.R. Martin, but is the movie itself any good? In other words, is it more like the quality of early Game of Thrones or late Game of Thrones? Well, stick around and I will let you know my personal thoughts. Hello, welcome to the channel. Thank you for stopping by. I hope you're doing very well. My name is Sean Morgan and I love movies. And I love all kinds of movies, including goofy science fiction stuff like In the Lost Lands. I was interested in checking this one out when the trailer started circulating around my local multiplexes, even though the team assembled to make this movie did not necessarily indicate amazingness in terms of quality. In the Lost Lands is about a queen in a dystopian world who sends a feared sorceress into the wilderness so that this sorceress can acquire a magical ability and transfer it onto the queen. The sorceress in question teams up with a bounty hunter to achieve this goal, and the two trek through various science fiction locales to accomplish their mission. Battles are waged, twists are revealed, agents turn out to be double, etc. You know how these kinds of films usually end up going if you're familiar with the genre. The movie stars Mila Jovovich as the aforementioned sorceress named Grey Alice. It also stars Dave Bautista, Drax himself, as the bounty hunter Boyce. Rounding out the cast is Arlie Jover, Fraser James, Deirdre Mullins, and Evelyn Hall, among many others. Now, I'm not the biggest Jovovich fan, but Batista is absolutely one of my guys. Any member of the Guardians of the Galaxy will forever kind of have my support at the box office if I have any say in the matter. That trilogy of movies just means so much to me. And, I also legitimately think that Batista has chosen some interesting filmmakers to work with in the past. He has appeared in Blade Runner 2049 and the two, Denis Villeneuve Dune films. He's collaborated with Villeneuve, which I think speaks highly of his sort of taste in collaborators. I think he was also pretty good in Knock at the Cabin, a recent M. Night Shyamalan picture. I think he's pretty entertaining in Glass Onion, even though I prefer Knives Out to Glass Onion. I still think choosing to work with a filmmaker like Ryan Johnson, regardless of what you think of Ryan Johnson's work, he's certainly an interesting and very specific visionary. I also think it's interesting that Batista has worked with Zack Snyder in Army of the Dead. I also kind of run hot and cold on Zack Snyder, but I really, really enjoyed Army of the Dead. So you get the idea. I'm not saying that all of Batista's films, since he's popped off, have been 10 out of 10 in terms of pedigree, but I admire his overall choices. I'll say, though, that a trend I've noticed is that Batista is often better as a supporting actor than as a main player. That's just something that I have personally kind of decided must be the case. I think he's amazing as Drax. I think he's great in Blade Runner 2049. I think he's great in Knock at the Cabin, where he is kind of more of a main figure, but projects like Stuber or The Killer's Game didn't really connect with me in any sort of meaningful way. It's strange the films that he kind of tries to headline, I guess, haven't totally always worked for me across the board. I digress, though. As I stated earlier, In the Lost Lands is based on a George R.R. Martin short story. I have not read this short story, so I cannot speak to the quality of the film as a sort of faithful adaptation or an unfaithful adaptation of the source material. So I'll be speaking about the movie as a film only, just as a self contained kind of piece. Maybe someday I will get around to reading the short story. I have not read any of the Game of Thrones books either, but I really, really ate up that series. I just need to, I guess, incorporate that as a hobby. I don't read as much as I would like to, but I just want to make it clear from the jump. I have not read the source material. I can't speak to translating the source material on screen here. Just want to get that out there. So this film was directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, not to be confused with the superior, I think, filmmaker Paul Thomas Anderson. I don't think that's a very contested statement in the general, the general sphere of public opinion. In the Lost Lands is no Phantom Thread. It's no There Will Be Blood. That's for sure. W.S. Anderson is known for movies. For those of you who may not be super familiar with him, he's known for the Resident Evil series and something like Monster Hunter. I'm not very familiar with a lot of his directorial work, but I do really enjoy Alien versus Predator and the 1995 Mortal Kombat movie for what they are. Neither AVP nor that first Mortal Kombat movie is objectively incredible or anything, but I find them to be loads and loads of fun. So W.S. Anderson to me is best described, if I had to, kind of label him as what I'd call like a red box filmmaker, if that makes sense. Those of you who know what red box is, his films are best watched as like a tween or a teen boy in a musty basement. That is the prime W.S. Anderson experience. And I don't even mean that as like a negative either. I don't mean it to be rude. I just want to make that clear. Those nights as a tween or a teen are very formative to any budding film fan or budding cinephile. So that descriptor, I guess, may give my overall thoughts away on In the Lost Lands as a feature film. To me, the movie feels like it is warped into the modern day from the early 2000s, like it teleported from the mid 2000s to 2024 or 2025, excuse me. And that may sound great to you, that may sound fun to you, or it may sound awful. And I think, your mileage will obviously vary, but that's the best way I can describe it. The action is competent. The costumes are ridiculous. The twists, they're cheesy. The effects are very artificial looking, but I still found them charming nonetheless. It's a decent time for any sort of, person who likes comic booky or science fiction adjacent stuff. People who are junkies for that specific kind of genre or that specific kind of vibe. It fits into that category quite snugly and pretty definitively, in my opinion. The movies that I was thinking of, while I was walking out of this experience watching this movie were 2010's Jonah Hex, the first Nicolas Cage Ghost Rider, or even something like The Spirit from 2008, directed by Frank Miller. These are films that cannot be called objectively good, in my opinion. Those films that I just stated, but they still scratch an itch, at least for me, as far as like, oh, I kind of want to watch some pulpy comic book y trash. It's and that sometimes is an urge that people have, and sometimes there are movies that come out like this that fit the bill. I implied this comparison earlier, but it is worth noting that this will definitely not scratch any sort of itch for Game of Thrones fans who are thirsty for some sort of complicated, edge of your seat fantasy proceedings. That is for dang sure. I don't dislike the later seasons of Game of Thrones as much as most people do. I think I don't really have problems with where the story went at the end of Game of Thrones. I just have problems with how they paced out their various story beats. That's neither here nor there. Getting into that would take forever. But I can imagine that even the most vitriolic kind of late stage Game of Thrones haters will find In the Lost Lands to be kind of a misfire on a scientific level, if that makes sense. So don't come into this movie expecting completely mind blowing, shock value or any sort of moral. I mean, there's moral complexity, I guess, but the characters themselves, their dilemmas are not as complex as anybody in Game of Thrones. It's nowhere near the heights of even the worst Game of Thrones episode, if you ask me. I feel very comfortable making that claim. So, where does In the Lost Lands rank on my personal scale of A list, amazing, average, abysmal, or needs to be abolished? I think that In the Lost Lands gets a solid but pleasant abysmal rating, if that makes any sense. I cannot consciously say, for example, that it's above like 2 out of 5 stars if I had to quantify it into a number. But it's a 2 out of 5 star movie that I actually had kind of a decent time with while the runtime was going by. You know what I mean? So that's kind of where I land on that. Sometimes a movie is a 2 out of 5 that you kind of have a good time with anyway. If you're a true movie fan, I feel like you know exactly what I'm talking about. I saved $10.99 on this ticket by using AMC A List. I say this not because AMC A List is sponsoring me, but because I plan to add up my savings from A List at the end of 1 year to communicate how good of a deal it is or is not. They're actually upping the number of movies you can see per week as of today. I think it's going up from 3 to 4 movies a week. They're also increasing the price to justify, in order to coincide with that. I personally see enough movies where I predict that this will still turn out to save me money in the long run, but I'll let you know at the end of my little experiment whether or not that turns out to be true. You can stay tuned there. But did you see In the Lost Lands? And if you did, what did you think of it? Do you agree with me also that, the late stage Game of Thrones seasons get a little bit too much hate? That's kind of a hot take that I have. You probably don't agree with that take. That's okay. I'd actually love to know what people's personal favorite sort of red box movies are. That's a big question that I'm always kind of fascinated by. These are movies that, objectively aren't amazing, but are a fun time for, teens hanging out in musty basements, crushing sodas and potato chips. Feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel, answer any of the questions that I've asked in the comments, whatever you prefer. Until next time, don't ask strange sorcerers in your town to go on fetch quests for you. It will almost definitely turn into a monkey's paw situation and burn you. Uh, anyway, stay safe. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, bye.